Hello, nature lovers, and welcome to another exciting episode of Environmental Systems and Societies. Today is all about how species form, and we're really looking at speciation, which comes about via natural selection or evolution, and one of the driving forces for that is physical barriers. So let's start by talking about what speciation is, and it's the idea that you have two populations, and they start the same, they're the same species, but over time they change into two different populations that can no longer breed, so we call that two different species. And a lot of times this happens because they get separated by things like mountains. Now, you can't talk about speciation without talking about evolution. And so basically evolution is the idea that organisms change over time, okay? And it's really not individual organisms, it's populations change over time. And the changes are caused by mutations. Now, sometimes these mutations will kill an individual in a population, but sometimes it won't. So let's talk about mutations for a minute. A mutation is simply a change in the DNA. Sometimes it's one of the bases, like the guanine or adenine or thymine or cytosine, changing order, or sometimes it's whole strands of DNA moving around on the chromosome. Either way, these mutations cause different proteins to be made, and those proteins can either be harmful to an organism like this, or it can be helpful. Or, well, it could have no effect. But the mutation, if it doesn't kill the organism, it can actually be passed on to the organism's offspring, okay? And then they can pass on their offspring and so forth until it spreads out through the whole population. Now, these mutations usually are tiny, okay? They're small. So it may just be like a pattern on a lizard's skin is different, which maybe is a good thing. It helps it camouflage better. Or sometimes the chloroplast is working better. But eventually, it all starts to kind of build up together. So maybe we have a little bit of change in color on this one, and then we have a little bit longer leg on this one, and then we have a little bit better eyesight on this one. And over time, all these changes start to happen until they're now different species. And that's what we sort of see happening is there's these small changes that build up over time to make a new species. And that's what we call evolution. Okay? You gotta have a little bit of humor, so come on, work with me, people. Okay, so what's natural selection then? You know what evolution is. Well, natural selection is the mechanism that is the motivation for evolution, maybe. It's the thing that makes it happen. And what I mean by that, it's not the thing that causes the mutations, but it's the thing that selects for it. So I'm gonna give you an example about these moths, okay? So back before the Industrial Revolution, there was a moth, and pepper moth, and it's white in color, and it would get on birch trees, and it was super camouflaged from birds that love to eat it. Okay, every once in a while, a black moth would be born, but that black moth stood out big time, and so its genes were not passed forward. But then the Industrial Revolution came along, and the trees got covered with soot. So now the white moths stood out and started getting eaten. Their genes were not passed on, but the occasional black moth was born, and it lived, and it passed its genes. So now the black moth's population grew. And this is totally random. It's not like it was trying to hide. It just was random, okay? And so that's an example of natural selection choosing the trait. And this happens a lot of times with different populations. So if you have two groups of moths split up by something, and one thing is kind of putting pressure on it this way and a different thing on this way, that we see these populations evolving differently, okay? Now, everybody likes to hear an example of this happening, and this is one of our best examples, and it's kind of called a ring species. The idea is this salamander on the left evolves into the salamander on the right, and it goes in steps, and it can breed with the one next to it, but it can't breed with the one at the end, okay? And so we look at it, and the DNA is consistent with this. It says that it's had these tiny changes that have built up over time, and the mountains separated these populations, preventing them from interbreeding, and so now we have two separate species of salamanders. And this could happen, deer could be out here and there's a forest fire that separates the forest, and now that's a physical barrier, and so now these deer can evolve independently over time. This could happen with frogs or turtles and a highway, right? Could be something natural like a river, but it could be something man-made like a highway. And lately, when we talk about physical barriers, this is what we're usually talking about. We're talking about highways, we're talking about farms, we're talking about pipelines, we're talking about things that break up a population into two populations and allows them to evolve separately. Okay. Now, the mother of all natural physical barriers is continental drift. And the idea is this: the world's broken up into plates. They float on magma. They move together. They spread apart. They move together. They spread apart. At one point, we had Pangea, which was all the continents together. Then it broke into two. And then it broke into more. And that's what this diagram's showing you. Well, what's really cool about this is that we have found evidence that where the continents were together at one point, the species existed there and then got separated as the continents pulled apart. So now we had two populations of the same species, but on different continents, okay? And so, there used to be marsupials and placental mammals in both South America and Australia, but then they competed after they got separated, and it turned out that in South America, the placental mammals won, and in Australia, the marsupials won, which is kind of cool. But anyway, basically, what also happens here as these things spread out is that animals start to occupy the same niches. They look similar, but they are different animals that have evolved in different ways. So on the left here, you have all the placentals, and on the right, you have all the marsupials, okay? So how do we know all this? Well, really simply, we have fossil records. So we have fossils of where Africa and South America fit into each other, and on the coast of each of those places, we see that animal's fossils, and we don't see it anywhere else in the world. And we see that in lots of places where we think the land has joined together. And we see mineral deposits that are the same way. They're only in those two places. So that suggests us that those rocks are the same. It suggests us the animal lived in both places and that this stuff split up, which I think is incredibly cool. Well, I hope this explained natural selection and evolution and speciation and physical barriers. If you have questions, please let me know. And if not, peace out, homie. Oh, that's awkward.